he is good. For he is good. Give thanks to the Lord. For he is good. For he is good. Give thanks to the Lord. For he is good. For he is good. His love endures forever.
His love will reign
forevermore.
His power will reign
forevermore.
His grace will reign
forevermore.
His peace will reign
forevermore.
His love will reign
forevermore.
His power will reign
forevermore.
His love
endures forever.
Okay, yes, we went to Jericho in our trip. Now, Jericho is actually located. It's it's in that valley there, or quite close to the highlands on the western side of that Rift Valley that goes through Israel. The Jordan River goes down to it, and then there's the Dead Sea, and Jericho is just north and a little bit east of the Dead Sea, and I'll show you a map in a little while. And the thing is, it's where the children of Israel, how they sort of entered the Promised Land. So we were there, and it's part of it's in Palestinian controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Therefore, we had to get special permission to go in, and our Israeli Jewish guide, Svi, wasn't allowed to come with us, which is a little bit silly, but anyway. However, the place was very nice, and the shop next door was very nice. So we had some, just to show you just to give you an idea of what the place looks like now, and a few pictures I took. This is basically what they call a revetment wall, or a retaining wall, which we'll get to a bit later on. This may not necessarily be the original one, but this is sort of just basically, like a lot of sites, Jericho is just a pile of stones and some holes in the ground where people have been digging. This is an interesting part of a trench, and if you can see there, you can see traces, and this struck me as weird at the time when I was there. There's traces of bricks there, like there was a brick wall there, or a brick wall somewhere, and it ended up there. This is actually a part of a tower that was built well before the period that we're talking about with the children of Israel, probably at least 1,000 years before. But it was a big defensive tower, very solid. And there is, just to show that we were, that's Glenn Colley right there, who's an American preacher that some people may have heard of. He writes a lot of books that we have in our library, actually. He came along and he preached a short devotional and talk here, and there's modern Jericho there in the background. And last but not least, there were camel rides. No, I didn't. Okay, so just to get you a bit more about what Jericho is now, the tell of Jericho, the pile of soil and material that builds up over time in successive settlements in the ancient times. From the air, it looks like this. And so you've got this part around here is most of the old city of Jericho. I'll just leave that there for a little while. There's archaeological evidence for habitation going so far back that it's one of the oldest cities in the world, if not the oldest city in the world. There have been around 23 successive settlements on this site. Now that's a lot. The fact that one settlement would fall means there's an awful lot of conflict going on, I suspect. There are many springs in the area, which is the reason for Jericho being called the city of palm trees in the Old Testament. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 3, it says in part that the plain in the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees. So you can imagine the sort of oasis palm trees kind of idea. So when the children of Israel, led at this stage by Joshua, came through here, they crossed the Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, and the first city that they came to was Jericho. So why did they need to take this city? Well, the first thing was that in the beginning of Joshua chapter 6, God actually commanded it. In fact, he said, and we'll read this together a bit later, but he said in part, "I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors." So this was God's intention, that they should take Jericho. Just looking at the map, oh sorry, that's right, there's a reconstruction of Jericho there. I did have a little video that sort of panned through it, etc., but I didn't think it would be very visible, so I haven't included it. But see, there's two walls, and there's a lot of building going on between the walls, and that is, you would speculate, or it was reasonable to say, that's the lower rent district on the outer part of the city, less defended, etc. And we'll get to that a bit later, because that's probably in that area is where Rahab lived. So we have the centre, we have the gate, etc. Very strongly defended city, because those walls are tall, and we'll get to that in a minute. So it's strategically important. You couldn't bypass it, because it would stay, and if we look at this map, it would stay a thorn in your side. So this is the Dead Sea, this is the road going east, it's a major trade route sort of thing. The children of Israel came up from the south, and they camped around here, and then went across the Jordan River, and on to Jericho. Now Jericho is heavily fortified, as I said. It's 10 kilometres from the Jordan, 12 kilometres from the Dead Sea, so this is all pretty small area. In fact, Israel's a pretty small place, really. And 22 kilometres from Jerusalem. That's not too far. It's also 1,000 metres lower than Jerusalem. In just that distance, there's a drop of 1,000 metres, and there's about 1,500 or something, or 2,000 metres drop to the Dead Sea, which is why it's the Dead Sea. The water flows in, doesn't flow out. And also, this road has a ford over the Jordan, which is a very important place to cross, and so it's a sort of the whole thing makes it strategically very important, which is why it's there and why it's fortified so well. Okay, if we look at the tell again, you can see this is where the walls would have been superimposed on there. The two walls, and if we have a look at this is a larger part of the original retaining wall, which was below the outer wall, and it's important because these walls remained, and they didn't actually come down, for the most part. So they're quite tall. They are something like 4 metres tall. So if we have a look at how it was done in sort of a diagram. By the way, the guy in the blue top there is Jonathan Moore, who'll be leading our tour to Egypt in a couple of months. So look forward to Tales from Egypt next year. So there's the retaining wall. And so we have the retaining wall in the diagram, and on top of that was a mud brick wall. So the retaining wall was 4 metres high, the mud brick wall on top 7 or 8 metres high. This is the outer wall, so you got a lot of wall there. And then the inner wall is another 5 or 6 metres high. That's the wall that's the second layer. And so, I mean, combined, 16 to 18 metres of wall, which is quite a lot. Now, the people of Israel did not have any sort of military ability to take the city. They didn't really have at that stage a trained army, and they didn't have any sort of siege equipment or anything like that to actually scale these walls or knock them down or anything like that. They really could not do this on their own. But of course, as we know and as we read, God was with them. So here we are. This is where the Israelites came. They camped at a place called Shittim, and to get ready for what they were going to do. Now, what I'd like to do now is we'll just read the biblical account of what is written to do with the story of Jericho, and the story starts. in Joshua chapter 2. This is well before the actual attack. This starts with the fact that they sent out some spies, and I'm going to read most of, from in Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 through to 20. It's a bit long, but it's, to be honest, both of these are really cracking good tales, actually, so they're really interesting. And I know we've probably read this many times before, but let's just go through it again. Okay, this is Joshua chapter 2, starting at verse 1. Then Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came into the house of a harlot, whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. It was told to the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men from the sons of Israel have come here tonight and to search out the land." And the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." But the woman who had taken the 2 men and hidden them said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. It came about when it was time to shut the gate at dark that the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them in the stalks of flax which she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued them on the road to the Jordan, to the fords, and as soon as those who were pursuing them had gone out, they shut the gate. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore, please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you will deal kindly with my father's household and give me a pledge of truth, and spare my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death." So the men said to her, "Our life is yours if you do not tell this business of ours, and it shall come about when the Lord gives us the land that we will deal kindly and faithfully with you." Sorry, I forgot this is basically what we're going to see in this reading. So firstly, Rahab hides the spies, and then she makes an agreement with them. Now, of course, you could say partly this is self-preservation. She could see the writing on the wall. She has an opportunity to actually talk to these Israelites and make some sort of deal. And of course she does, because, well, they're in her hands at the moment. She could have given them away to the authorities, but she didn't. But as well as that, what she says here isn't just, "Oh, these people are dangerous, I need to do something about it." She's quite sure not only that the Israelites are dangerous and powerful, but that their God is with them, and she could see the work of God in what they did. As she said in verse 11, "Because of you, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." So she has this faith in God, brought about by what she had heard. And it goes back 40 years back to the parting of the Red Sea. So that word had come all the way from the Red Sea to there, and the reputation preceded them, as they say. Okay, we'll just continue reading from verse 15. "So she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house," and this is important, "for her house was on the city wall, so that she was living on the wall." That's the outer wall of the city. She said to them, "Go to the hill country," that's to the west here, and it's still called the hill country. So go the opposite direction that they expect you to be going. "Go to the hill country so that the pursuers will not happen upon you, and hide yourselves there for 3 days until the pursuers return. Then afterward you may go on your way." The men said to her, "We shall be free from this oath to you when you have made us swear, unless when you come into the land you tie this cord of scarlet in the windows through which you have let us down, to gather to yourself into the house your father and mother and brothers and all your father's household. It will come about that anyone who goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be free. But anyone who is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid upon them. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be free from the oath which you have made us swear. So it's a very serious discussion they're having about life and death discussion. And this, their house is marked on the outer wall by this scarlet ribbon or thread, as it's said. So they were thinking ahead. This is how we'll know that this is Rahab's house and they're not to be touched. So the spies do escape. And then later on, let's go forward to chapter 6. About the conquest of Jericho. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors." And then he gave some instructions that didn't seem very military at all. "You shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days, and 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up every man straight ahead." That's important to note. That's an important part, that. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord." And so in the subsequent verses, this is actually what happens. And we'll just go forward to... So in verse 14 it says, "On the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. And they did that for 6 days. Marched around the city, blew the horns, etc. Then on the 7th day," verse 15, "they rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around 7 times. At the 7th time, when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, 'Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city shall be under the ban, and it and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent.'" And then he gives them, admonishes them not to take stuff from the city, that the city is to be destroyed, except for the silver and the gold, etc., which are for the Lord. So in verse 20 it says, "The people shouted, the priests blew the trumpet, and the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city." Now when it says every man straight ahead, they were around the city, the walls came down, and they were able to go straight in from where they were, straight ahead. Now, the mud brick walls came down, but the retaining wall, that stone wall, did not. So here's a diagram. You've got the retaining wall, the first mud brick wall, the second one. And what happened was that both of the mud brick walls, this is the archaeological evidence, both of the mud brick walls came down, a bit like that. And then, because the rubble from the mud brick was piled up against the retaining wall, they were able to march straight up into the city. And that's what has been found, that the retaining wall is largely intact, and that there's evidence of a lot of the mud brick being at the bottom there. So we'll just read on. From verse 21. "They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, 'Go to the harlot's house and bring the woman, and all she has out there, as you have sworn to her." So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all she had. They also brought out all their relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put in the treasury of the house of the Lord. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had, Joshua spared, and she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Israel sent to spy out Jericho. And then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city, Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son he shall set up his gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all of the land. So this all basically went as planned. So there's archaeological evidence of the walls there. What about some of the other things that we read about? For example, the archaeologists found that the city had been totally destroyed by fire. What happens with these things in archaeology is that you have your mound of the remains, they call it a tell, and there's layer upon layer put up in subsequent periods of history. And there's often they find things called a destruction layer or a burned layer, and this is what is there in this tell, and it corresponds to the time, the date of these events. The destruction layer dates from around 1400 BC, which is when the children of Israel were there, when all these things happened. There has been some dispute about that date, but the best evidence is 1400 BC. So here we are. This is, I hope it's better than what I can see. This is a big black blob. It is actually material taken from the destruction layer. It's burnt soil, burnt material, silt, etc. that's taken from that. So this dates the final destruction of the Canaanite city of Jericho to the time of the Israelite conquest. So they match together. Also, there's other evidence within the layer of material around this time. They find what they call scarabs. Now, scarabs are little pieces. They're meant to they resemble a scarab beetle, around about the same size. They're little pieces of jewellery. Often they're covered in gold, not anymore, but and they're a really good indication of dates in finds. They're Egyptian things, and they're they have Egyptian hieroglyphics on them. The hieroglyphics represent the pharaoh, and it's a bit like having a picture of the queen on a little or something on your as a brooch or some other piece of jewellery, and they're really good. And if you find one of these with belonging to a particular pharaoh, you know that obviously it couldn't have been before then. It couldn't have been before then because that pharaoh wasn't on the throne yet, and these things wouldn't have been made. So there's three different pharaohs. One of them seems to have two. Hatshepsut from 1479 to 1458. Thutmose III from 1458 to 1425, and then Amenhotep, who was actually a lady from 1390 to 1352, all around 1400 BC. So archaeologists consider that to be a really good marker for these sorts of things. And the destruction of the city can also be dated back to do with the time of year. It can be dated to the spring, not long after the grain harvest, because there is a verse, if we look in Joshua chapter 3, verse 15, and I'll just read the part of it. It says, this is them crossing the Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, just before the attack. And it says that those who carried the ark came into the Jordan. At the feet of the priests carrying the ark were dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest. And so they came across in the time of harvest, which was the spring. Now, what they found in the city was earthen jars full of grain. The grain had been burnt. It had been left there and burnt. Now, that gives you a couple of things. One, they were full of grain, so this was not long after the harvest. And secondly, because they were left there to burn, it means that what actually happened was that the population didn't have a siege and eat the grain. They didn't flee taking the grain with them. Everything happened here. They weren't able to, the grain was basically not eaten or taken. This was a sudden thing, not a long siege. And one more thing is that to do with Rahab. Remember, they were promised that they wouldn't, that they'd be spared. Now remember that her house was built right up against the wall, which is how she could let them out the window to the outside of the city. Now, if the walls all came tumbling down, then her house would have been destroyed along with everything else. But there is a section of the wall to the north side of the city which was found left standing. Now, this is very circumstantial evidence, and this area also had some houses when they were originally excavated back in the 1920s. The house, you could see the houses were sort of semi-intact, and they were concluding from all this what they found this was a poor area of Jericho, partly because it was in the outer area near the outer wall, and being built on the outer wall would have been the poorest of the poor, the low rent district, as they would say. Considering Rahab's profession, and then it may well have been where she lived. So that's all speculation, of course, but the very fact that some of the wall did not come down when everything else did is very interesting. And again, of course, there had to be, because even at that time, it had to be because they were able to find this red thread that was actually on the window. Now, since then, several settlements have been called Jericho, and they've been built in the area, but not actually in that same place, not on the tell itself. Remember that Joshua had that curse of people who would build the city again, and it looks like it never did happen again. It's one of these settlements that was built by Herod Archelaus, son of Herod the Great, that is the Jericho of the New Testament. It's here that Jesus restored sight to the blind. In Luke 18:35, as Jesus was approaching Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road begging. And this is where Zacchaeus lived. In Luke 19, verses 1 and 2, he entered Jericho and was passing through, and there was a man called by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. It was on the road that went from Jericho up to Jerusalem that Jesus cited the parable about the Good Samaritan, where Jesus said a man was going down to Jerusalem. This is Luke 10:30. Going down to Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. So Jericho as a city was certainly there in the New Testament, but not on that actual site. It was elsewhere, and of course there's plenty of modern city there as well. Okay, so that's the biblical account. That's the archaeology which bears that, which confirms many of the things that we read about in that account. So what can we learn from this? And there are two things I just wanted to mention. The first is that once again, the lesson that of the actual attack of the city, the success of the attack of the city, was that Joshua was told to do something that wasn't necessarily, it was a bit odd. It wasn't necessarily what you'd expect to have to do to take a city, but they did it. They trusted and obeyed God, and the city was taken because of that. It's a bit like who was it? Now I've forgotten. I should have written this down. But who had leprosy and had to dip in the Jordan 7 times? It was Nahum. Nahum told him to. It was somebody else. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm sure you know this better than I do. But he had to dip in the Jordan River 7 times to be cured of leprosy. And he was thinking, well, you're kidding, you know. Not only is this a bit pointless, but also the Jordan, it's not exactly it's not a great river. But of course, he was assured in no uncertain terms, if God tells you to do this, just do it. What's the problem? And the same thing with the people of Israel there around Jericho. If God wants you to march around the city 7 times, just for 7 days, and then blow your trumpets and everything, and I'm sure the people on the walls in Jericho would have thought this was very funny, then do it. What's the harm? What's the problem? So they did it, and that was the result. And that's a really good example for us, that we need to understand that the wisdom of God is far greater than our own. And sometimes things happen to us in our life that we don't understand, but we have to realise and trust God, that God knows what is going on and is in control. And the second lesson, I think, is to do with Rahab. Rahab is quite someone, a great example to us. She took in these people, knowing they were spies and knowing that her life was now in danger because of this. And she hid them, and she lied to the authorities, and she let them out at huge risk to herself. Not because she'd had some vision from God, not because she'd read something in the scriptures, but because of what she'd heard about what the Israelites could do. And she realised that if they could do all of that and part the Red Sea and all of that, then their God must be the God. Their God is the one that she should be worshipping, that she should align herself with. And this is what happened. And that faith was rewarded. She was spared, and she was welcomed into the community of Israel, and she basically, let me just get this right. Basically, she became one of the people in the genealogy of Jesus, because she was the mother of Boaz, as we read about in Ruth. He married Ruth, and Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David. And of course, David is in the line, Jesus is directly down in the line from David. So not only was she actually became like a proselyte, a Jew, but she was actually in the line of Jesus. So her faith is a great example to us. As it says in 2 Corinthians 5:7, that we walk by faith and not by sight. She certainly did that. She walked by faith and not by sight. And also in James chapter 2, verse 25, she's mentioned specifically by James that her faith was justified by her works. So not only did she decide that God was the God, but she actually demonstrated that by risking her life to save these spies. So I guess the example we have is to put our trust in God, even if we're not entirely, if it's not the safe thing to do, even if you don't understand what God is asking you to do. And the story shows that God is a forgiving and merciful God to those who demonstrate faith, even to those who sin. There's no sin that God, except the unforgivable sin, I guess, which is a different sort of thing. But there is no sin. You could be a terrible, terrible person, but if you change your mind, have faith in God, work to change your life, God will forgive and be merciful. And that takes humility and obedience, which is what Rahab demonstrated. So I suggest that we think on these things as we stand and we sing our final hymn. And if you're not a Christian, consider that this story, which shows the faithfulness and the mercy and the forgiveness of God, and God can and will forgive you, and will be able to help you with anything that is troubling your heart.
His love endures forever. Everybody give thanks
To the Lord, for he is good.